Hello, friends. Welcome to the third iteration of this Nietzsche November series, where each week we're breaking down, exploring, and discussing a different book from Friedrich Nietzsche. And this week we're discussing On the Genealogy of Morals, which, for only a 140-page book, at least in this Penguin edition, it kind of throws you for a doozy. And this is the first book I'm actually going through to reread. So the first two books of this series, On the Birth of Tragedy and The Gay Science, those were new reads for me. So I was kind of going in with fresh eyes. I've obviously read Nietzsche, but they were a new experience for me. On the genealogy of morals, though, I've read before. So going back and seeing some of the notes I'd taken in the past, different sections I've tabbed, looking on Notion at my previous notes I had transferred, I saw one, I had a little bit of a recollection of what was discussed, but I also saw I got a lot of things wrong. And primarily that's because Nietzsche is not the easiest read, but also I read this very early in my philosophical journey. So I didn't have any understanding of who the hell Kant was, what is Schopenhauer's will, so many different figures that are referenced in this book. I had no clue what Nietzsche was referring to. So, coming back with fresh eyes after reading these two previous works and being able to kind of dig back into this the second time around, I had a good experience. And I feel like I could digest every page, every section, each essay with greater depth. Now, the only problem with that is there is a lot of depth in this book. So with that in mind, this is another great chance to offer a little bit of a disclaimer again to the series. I'm not a scholar. I don't have any degree in philosophy. I am very much an autodidact and go through this in a very self-taught, explorative way. So, with that in mind, don't take everything in this video for gospel. It is my own attempt at analysis. Other videos, podcasts, do a far better job at discussing this book and these concepts in far greater, more accurate depth. So, with that in mind, again, the whole point of the series is for me to kind of test myself, dig deeper into these great works, and then also to hear from you guys and have that discussion down in the comments, a little bit of back and forth on what you got out of the book, what stood out to you, what do you think of Nietzsche's perspective, and all of that. Now, before we get into the work itself, I do want to mention all the page numbers and the translation that I'm going to be working from is from this Penguin edition. The translator is Michael Scarpitti, I think is how it's pronounced. But this is the edition that I'm using. I'll link it down below so you can get it as well. And I'm also going to link a free PDF to the book as well. So if you don't want to buy the book, you can also reference it, read it, and join along. With all that said, let's get into the book itself. So just like the past two videos, before we get into the text itself, I want to bring forth a few key terms or concepts that are important to know that we're going to get into later in this work. First and foremost, it's the idea that this book was written after Beyond Good and Evil. Now, why did I choose to read this before it? Why did I put it in this order, out of chronological order for this series? Well, the reason is the same as the reason why I read it in this way in the first place and why it was recommended to me in this order. And that's because it's a little bit of a shorter read and a little bit of a brief overview of some of the concepts that are dug upon much deeper in Beyond Good and Evil. So you get the explanation of slave morality, of mass morality, of ressentiment, of his critiques of morality and how Judeo-Christian values kind of created morality, sin, guilt, bad conscience. We get all of that introduced in this work in a little bit of a, it's not really an overview or a preview or a prequel to Beyond Good and Evil, because literally this is, chronologically a sequel, and he digs into different concepts a little bit in those works. But to summarize, to put it succinctly, I think this is a good kind of preview introductory work before you get into Beyond Good and Evil, which I'm reading right now, and I'm remembering how difficult of a book it can be. So that's why I chose that order, why we're reading it first here in the series. And again, some of those key concepts to think about as you're going into this book, things to pick up on, I would say, are those discussions, those basically that dichotomy well, it's not really a dichotomy. The two types of morality that Nietzsche presents us with, of mass morality and slave morality. So you want to pay attention to that. You also want to pay attention to the second essay. He's exploring guilt, bad conscience, sin, redemption, how all of this is influenced and kind of instigated from religion, specifically Judaism. And then in the third essay, you're going to see all about the ascetic ideal and asceticism and all of that. So with all that in mind, let's dig into the actual text itself. Digging into the text, we see in the preface the main questions Nietzsche is trying to answer within these essays. So he says on page 5, under what conditions did man invent for himself those judgments of value, good and evil, and what intrinsic value do they possess in themselves? So he's looking at morality and how it's positioning good against evil, and he's trying to say, okay, well, where does good originate from? Hence the genealogy of morals. Where do these morals come from? Where do these value judgments that we place upon the word good and the word evil? How do we where are these value judgments coming from? Why are we assigning certain people, certain behaviors, certain instincts to good versus evil, etc. So that's what he's trying to explore, is where did morality originate? Where did these values come from? So, like usual, every page in a Nietzsche book typically has a lot of value and a lot going on in it. And this first essay is no different. He gets right to the business of explaining where the hell did good and bad come from. So we have this prehistoric state of man before morality is more formalized, where the morality system is based on good and bad. Now, where do good and bad originate from? Well, if we look at the text, the second section within the first essay, he's getting right to it and discussing where good and bad originated from. Previously, philosophers in Nietzsche's eye were perceiving good from a point of view of usefulness and utility. What was beneficial to me? How was this act benefiting me? And I was labeling it as good. Nietzsche rejects this idea because he doesn't believe that good is being interpreted from the consequence or from the person receiving the act, so to speak. He believes that the good originated from the nobility, the master class, the powerful, the strong-willed, labeling and perceiving themselves as good. And then because of that, he describes this as noble, the powerful, those of high degree, the high-minded, who have felt that they themselves were good. And in opposition or relation, the low, the plebeian, the lower class people, the weak, the cowardly, the timid, were perceived as bad. So we have the system of good, where it is those who can assert themselves in society or in life. It is the kind of life affirmation, the will to power, which we'll get into later, the strong-willed. Okay, on one side are interpreting themselves as good, and then on the bad we have the weak-willed, those who are unable to assert themselves, the oppressed, so to speak. Now, it's important to note here that from Nietzsche's perspective, the good, the powerful, the nobility are not depicting or labeling the lower class as bad with sinister implications. It's kind of just a byproduct of, if they're the good, in comparison, they have to be depicted as the bad. Now, why that matters is because what happens with the slave morality is quite the opposite, where they are coming from a position of vengeance, of revenge, of ressentiment, or resentment is the word that Nietzsche uses here. He calls it the most cunning revenge, a radical transformation of values, in which the weak have essentially flipped the script and inverted morality and start to depict the strong, the previously good, the strong-willed, the noble as evil. And he says this on page 28, he has conceived the evil enemy, the evil one, and indeed that is the inspiration from which he now concocts as a counterpart the good one, himself, his very self. So, contrary to mass morality, and this is an important point, mass morality, again, defines themselves, the strong-willed, these kind of aristocratic individuals, as good, and then in opposition, the lower class, the weak-willed, are the bad. The inverse happens within slave morality. Because it originates in a reactionary fashion, because it originates from this point of ressentiment, of vengefulness against the perceived oppressors, they depict them first as evil and then by default, they themselves become the good, the righteous, the moralist, essentially. And a good way to think about this is the example of birds of prey and the lamb that and a good way to think about this is the birds of prey and lamb example that Nietzsche uses on page 32. And it also reminds me of this meme I saw recently on Instagram where it has this, book title, and on one side it has a happy smiling face and it says watching the lion eat the deer while watching the documentary about lions. That's the masterclass side of things. And then you see this grumpy, vengeful, angry face on the other side and it says watching the lion eat the deer while watching the documentary about deers. So you see this perspective that Nietzsche has, that morality it doesn't come from this objective perspective. There is no objective morality. There is no objective truth outside of our subjectivity and our interpretation. And one of his quotes, I believe it's in Beyond Good and Evil, but feel free to correct me if it's not, is that there are no facts, just mere interpretations. And that's very much how Nietzsche views it. So digging into the example on page 32, we see these birds of prey that are swooping in, obviously, to eat the lamb. And from the birds of prey perspective, they are just eating, to feel good. It's beneficial, it's useful, it's of utility to them, so that they're actually in the good. But obviously, from the lamb's perspective, they are evil. They are the evil one. They are coming to kill us, to oppress us, right? And so you see that morality very much is a matter of interpretation, a matter of perspective. And again, this is where the birds of prey say, we bear no ill will against these fine, goodly lambs. We even like them. Nothing is tastier than a tender lamb. But again, the birds of prey, as the lambs perceive it, those birds of prey are evil, etc., etc. So again, that's just an important concept to think about. Is Nietzsche does not believe there is some, intrinsic good or value within the good that is separate from our own subjectivity or interpretation. And rounding off this first essay, we also see Nietzsche explain that the weak view themselves as virtuous and righteous because they assign free will or volition to their own weakness. So they believe that their weakness isn't a byproduct of their own instincts or inherent weak will, but that they're choosing not to oppress others. So it's kind of like a lion that has no claws or no teeth. It's like, well, of course it's not going and attacking any gazelle. It's not capable of doing such. That doesn't make the lion without claws any more righteous, if that makes sense. And he explains this well on page 34, where he says that the weak have essentially cloaked themselves in this finery of an ascetic, mute, and patient virtue. They interpret their weakness as freedom, as some kind of choice, or their ability to act against their instincts makes them virtuous for not being an oppressor or willing themselves against others like the masterclass do. And it's this emphasis and perception of free will and intention and how intention plays a role in action that leads us to the second essay. It leads us to guilt, bad conscience, and eventually to the ascetic ideal. All right, moving on to the second essay, guilt, bad conscience, and related matters. We see him emphasize this concept of responsibility. And as conscious, rational creatures, we have this interesting ability, or this unique ability, to anticipate things, to understand our place in time, to understand a future, a present, and a past. And what this does is it allows us to make promises. We can say we're going to act a certain way. We can have a sense of responsibility for ourselves, for our actions, for holding up our end of something. And so he builds upon this on page 46, where he says to be responsible for oneself with all due pride, and thus at the same time to be free to affirm oneself, that is, as I have already said, a ripe fruit, but also a late fruit. How long must this fruit have hung sour and bitter on the tree? And for an even longer period there was not a glimpse of such a fruit to be had. No one had ventured to promise it, though everything on the tree was certainly ready for it, and everything was maturing for that very consummation. And so with this in mind, Nietzsche starts to articulate where he believes the origin of punishment occurs. How did we get from this point of punishing man in order to eventually tame him, to essentially start to remove our barbaric, our animalistic instincts for cruelty and violence. And the way that we do this, or that he believes we have done this, is through blood, torment, and sacrifice were necessary for man to create memory in himself. So he believes that through infliction of pain, this is how we were to remember to not act in a certain way. Think about it. If you were like me, you got spanked as a kid, and you got spanked to remember, oh, not to do whatever it is that got me spanked. So it's a bit of curbing behavior through the infliction of pain because we will remember that pain. So that's how he describes that the origin of punishment was to make it, quote, unforgettable. He says, how much blood and cruelty lies at the foundation of all good things, because it was through this pain, through this punishment, that we were able to tame man and create civilization down the line to be more civilized creatures. Building upon this, he discusses that punishment wasn't done originally because of responsibility, because of intention and free will, as we were discussing, that the slave morality is asserting. There wasn't this presumption of responsibility. The whole point of punishment was essentially to get repaid for the injustice or the injurious act that was occurred. So if you came in and punched my arm, I'm going to punch your arm and inflict that pain, so that you remember that, okay, if you punch me, I'm going to punch you back. There's this equivalent price being paid back and forth. So for a while in human history, pain, or the infliction of pain, was utilized as a system of repayment, essentially. There was this relationship between the creditor and debtor. And so if someone was unable to pay their debts to a creditor, the creditor could inflict pain upon them, and they would derive satisfaction from inflicting that pain. A lot of it comes from a sense of feeling superior, feeling more powerful than the person you're inflicting the pain upon. Now, why that matters is because even as we start to tame man, we still have this animalistic instinct for cruelty, still for inflicting pain. He says on page 52, to witness suffering does one good. To inflict suffering does one even more good. This is a harsh sentiment, but nonetheless a fundamental one, ancient, strong, and human, all too human, which is, of course, expanded upon in his book, Human, All Too Human as well. So put a pin in that for now. A little bit further on in this essay on page 61, we get to see Nietzsche explain where he believes law originates and how the establishment of law leads to this interpretation of right and wrong. A very subjective perspective of right and wrong, to be exact. He says here on page 61, this principle, right and wrong, first come to be after the establishment of law. To speak of intrinsic right and wrong is absolutely nonsensical. Again, going back, he doesn't believe that there is this objective right and wrong that we are discovering through science, or through reason, that we're now starting to implement in society. And specifically what law does too, that Nietzsche argues against, is it treats every man as equal, or at least it's supposed to. This egalitarian perspective of treating individuals equally. And Nietzsche believes that this model for society, that treats everyone as equal and every other will as equal, is hostile to life. It destroys man. Why? Well, because we're not all equal in Nietzsche's perspective. Not as far as the way that maybe we perceive it today, but specifically our will, that idea of everyone's will being equal. Nietzsche sees this as blatantly incorrect and quite injurious to the strong-willed, because there are the people that are naturally more ambitious, that are naturally have more skill. They're more skillful, they're more powerful, they're more aggressive, assertive in life. They are stronger-willed versus the timid, the cowardly, the lazy, the indolent, that don't, let's say, assert themselves as much. They have a weaker will to power. Nietzsche believes that that's quite apparent and that's quite obvious, and that by treating everyone as if they have equal wills in this situation is obviously not to his perspective. It doesn't align with his views. A better way to put it is that this system would weaken man. It would weaken his will to power and bring him down to the level of the weaker-willed. And why Nietzsche opposes this specifically is because, unlike Schopenhauer, or he references Herbert Spencer as well, he doesn't believe that the main power and force driving us, that drives our instincts, is will to survive or will to live. And he discusses Darwin at some point within this text as well. And that's, of course, the idea that human beings and all creatures are in this process of just seeking a way to survive. So it's this will to live, will to survive. Specifically, he describes it as adaptation. Now, why he doesn't side with adaptation, not that he doesn't believe it exists, but he doesn't believe it's like the core original force or the main driving force, is because adaptation by definition is a reactionary force. Something is happening to, let's say, me, so I'm adapting to it. I'm, resisting something to survive. Well, what am I resisting? What is that force that is bringing the resistance in the first place? That is what Nietzsche believes is the will to power, is the main driving force, the main instinct, the thing that is propelling us forward in life. Moving on, let's dig into Bad Conscience, which he really starts to lay the groundwork in page 70. So he as this quote here, he says, when he found himself finally imprisoned by the strictures imposed upon him by society to establish and preserve peace. I like he uses this example, this analogy to how we, through evolution, we were these marine creatures, right? Through Darwin's perspective, we were these marine creatures that eventually became accustomed to land. We adapted. And he describes like how awful and difficult and challenging must that have been to be these aquatic creatures that now became terrestrial creatures and had to completely kind of transform, and our instincts and all this had to change, right? He just says that that's how difficult it is for man to try and tame down his animalistic instincts, these instincts for will to power, these instincts to just be strong-willed, instincts for cruelty, all of this to kind of tame himself, to seek peace and become this more civilized creature, how difficult that is. And he says this quote, he says, they were reduced, those miserable creatures, to thinking, inferring, calculating, to connecting cause and effect, and had to resort to using their most poorly developed, least reliable organ, their consciousness. And that's what he's talking about, these creatures from aquatics now to humans. We have this least reliable organ, our consciousness. So with that in mind, we have this creature that is struggling to become tame, that is struggling to be this civilized, rational creature. And we're trying to use our rationality, which is our least reliable organ, as Nietzsche describes it. And here's the important point. This is where bad conscience originates, is because we take this cruelty that we have from the creditor-debtor relationship, from oppressing others, from inflicting pain, all of this, and what Judaism, or what this slave morality, this ressentiment has us do, is it turns it upon ourselves. We kind of flip the muzzle of the gun onto ourselves, which he quotes here. He says, the turning of all these instincts against their very owners is the origin of the bad conscience. So we see this, he says, of a declaration of war against the old instincts. And he says that the suffering of man from the affliction called man. So basically, we are creating our own suffering. We're turning these instincts upon ourselves. We're ascribing our own suffering to ourselves. We are the cause of our own suffering, and that is where this bad conscience originates from. Now, the interesting thing to remember again here is that we're taking this will to power, these instincts of power and life-affirming values and all of that, we're turning it upon ourselves and defining yourself as the origin. Man is the origin of our suffering. Nietzsche says that man finds delight in this suffering because I guess he's still able to inflict these instincts, inflict this willpower, inflict this oppressive, these cruel, torturous instincts. He's still able to act them out. They just happen to be upon himself. And now, later in this essay, on page 78, further on, he explains how Judeo-Christian values and Judaism, Christianity fits into this. Part of it is because man by default, essentially, is damned when he's on this earth because of original sin. Because of Adam and Eve, because of that original sin, we are sinful creatures. We are full of sin. We are full of this bad conscience, of this guilt. Now, how do we get redeemed? How do we, where do we turn to? Where do we look? And Nietzsche kind of mockingly says that it's through Jesus, and God comes down and pays the debt. So God essentially represents the creditor, and we owe him. We owe this payment, and that is why we suffer. That is why we have this bad conscience. We have this guilt, and that's why we're punished, because we have this unpaid debt that essentially Adam committed. We have this sin. We're sinful creatures. But interesting enough, God, as the creditor himself, as Nietzsche describes it, comes down in the form of Jesus and dies. He dies for our sins, right? That's the story of Jesus. He comes down to earth as the Son of God, as representation of God, and he dies for all of our sins, washes them away, and repays our debt. And that is how we get redemption and salvation later in heaven. And Nietzsche kind of mocks this, and he says, God as the one being who can deliver man from what man had become unable to deliver himself, the creditor playing scapegoat for his debtor, out of love. Can you believe it? Out of love for his debtor. So again, being very, tongue-in-cheek, mocking here, particularly because God is the creator of our suffering, but also the solution to it, the redeemer of it. So there's a little bit of that contradictory nature that Nietzsche's trying to point out there. So again, building upon that, where this delight in the suffering comes from is from Nietzsche. He says that is this desire for self-torture in the savage who suppresses his cruelty because he was forced to contain himself, and essentially by turning it upon himself, this is our natural outlet, since being a barbaric or oppressive creature by itself was blocked from us. We weren't able to do that anymore. Now we're in society, we're in a civilized situation, can't do that anymore, so we turn it upon ourselves to get that out, essentially, and the interpretation of that is sin. We feel sinful, we have this bad conscience and this guilt. So we essentially are the tormentor and the tormented, and it's because of this paradoxical situation going on that Nietzsche has this great few sentences here that are very, polemic and enthusiastic, where he says, "Alas for this mad melancholy beast, man! What wild fantasies are visited upon this beast? What perversity, paroxysm of hysteria, madness, and bestiality of ideas spring forth immediately if he is impeded in the slightest way from being the beast indeed." So, to round out the second essay, we're these sinful creatures. We've created bad conscience and guilt ourselves by turning these animal instincts upon ourselves because of this good and evil that has been created and established by the slave morality. We have this morality structure that has been developed, and we are feeling the weight of it, essentially. And this leads us down to the third essay, the Ascetic Ideal, in search of salvation and redemption here on earth. Now, the third essay gets it's quite convoluted. He jumps around on a lot of different topics. Part of it is probably, if you're like me, you're reading this book and your mind is getting a little bit tired, and Nietzsche is just kind of ramping up, and he's bouncing off the walls a little bit in this third essay. But he kind of starts it off looking at his old friend Wagner and also Schopenhauer, and of course criticizing them, as he loves to do now that they are no longer idols for him. And specifically, he's kind of looking at artists, philosophers, the ascetic priests, and also scientists, and how this ascetic ideal kind of plays within each of them. For example, religion looks at the truth and the good as kind of being separate from this world, because Jesus comes down, he says, "I am the truth, I am the good," and where is the good now? It's in heaven. It's not part of this world. So what do we have to do? We have to resign ourselves. We have to deny the will, because this world is full of illusion, it's full of error, full of sin. And so we have to kind of deny this existence. So that's where that ascetic deal fits in with religion. And then for philosophers, think of Schopenhauer. I described his perception of will and representation in the Birth of Tragedy video, so watch that if you need kind of a little refresher. But Schopenhauer views that our perception, everything that we kind of perceive in this world, is mere representation. It's not the thing in itself, so by default it is false, it is error, it is illusion. And the will is something to be resisted and negated for Schopenhauer. So again, you have this ascetic ideal, this asceticism coming in, where we have to deny the will. We have to kind of be in this place of self-contempt and self-hatred, self-abuse that occurs in that bad conscience and in that guilt. Nietzsche, of course, is like, whoa, guys, chill out. This is a very nihilistic way of acting and existing here on Earth. It's a very negative way to experience life. It's not very life affirming. It doesn't really benefit us all that much. And so he quotes here on page 103. He says, "The ascetic treats life as a wrong path, in which one must retrace one's steps till one comes to the place where it starts. Or he treats it as an error which one must refute through action, for he demands that he should be followed. He enforces where he can his judgment of existence." So essentially, the ascetic ideal, these ascetic priests, they kind of treat life as a bridge to the next reality, the truth. So it's by denying ourselves, this denial of the will, this kind of sinfulness, damnation that we exist within. It's a necessary evil essentially to go through as a bridge to truth, to the goodness eventually. Nietzsche, of course, rejects all this, says no, that's not it. And he says that the ascetic ideal springs from the prophylactic and self-preservative instincts which mark a decadent life. And he views the ascetic priest as essentially like the master behind this whole operation, where he's kind of creating the disease and creating the cure. Where he says on page 112, he says he carries with him, to be sure, balms and ointments, but before he can be the healer, he must first inflict injury. So while soothing the pain which the wound causes, he also puts poison in the wound. So he's kind of enabling this sin, this bad conscience, this guilt, this self-abuse that we are putting upon ourselves and inflicting. He's kind of enabling that, right? And promoting it through the ascetic ideal. And then he's promoting the solution, the salvation. It's through me, it's through the church, it's through God that you can be redeemed, that you can become righteous and worthy. Just listen to me. And by listening to the ascetic priest, what does he tell you? Well, he tells you that you are the reason for your suffering. Why are things going wrong for you in your life? Why do you have so much suffering and emotional distress? Well, it's because you're sinful. It's because you're being punished by God. Nietzsche says that everyone who suffers, in fact, seeks instinctively the cause of his suffering. It's not suffering that bothers us. It's senseless suffering. It's like, why do we suffer? I obviously don't like to suffer, but I at least like to know why. And we look for a culprit, and that's where that ressentiment comes from within slave morality. It's like, why am I oppressed? Why am I weak? Why am I low in society? Well, it's him. It's them. It's that person. They're oppressing me. And sometimes that's true, but that's basically what's going on. You're looking for a culprit. And what the ascetic ideal tells you to do, the ascetic priest, I should say, tells you to do, is to turn that finger, again, upon yourself. You are the reason why you're suffering. And on page 114, this is where Nietzsche puts quotes into the ascetic priest's mouth. He says, quote, "Quite so, my sheep, it must be the fault of someone, but you yourself are that someone. You alone are to blame. You yourself are to blame for yourself." So again, that's where ressentiment gets diverted and put upon yourself. And another quote I like is literally on the next page, on 115, where Nietzsche says, "The fact that anyone feels guilty or sinful is certainly no more proof that he is justified in feeling so than feeling healthy is proof that one is healthy," which I think is just a very great way of putting it. This is where Nietzsche, to kind of round out this book and this essay, starts to dig into psychology. And this is where he has big influence on Freud, because on the next section, in section 17, he begins to explore and go off on a tangent about depression and where it kind of originates from. And he explains how we all feel this sense of suffering and this feeling of physiological depression, he says. And the problem is, or the mistake he asserts, is that we're looking at it always from a point of moral psychology. Why do you feel depressed rather than what is causing you to be depressed? Which, it's, again, depression is a very evolving field that we still see today. Still trying to figure out, what works for different people. And he makes some kind of oddball, questionable hypotheses for where it originates. But one that I thought was pretty interesting is he mentioned the deficient diet, which we know is absolutely true. You eat crap, you feel like crap. You don't exercise, you don't feel good. The endorphins, the serotonin, the purpose, the activity. Aristotle and even Nietzsche, was a big proponent of saying that happiness and purpose and all that is going to be gained through activity. So it is just interesting, his connection between physiology and like the body and how it kind of reflects itself or impacts our psychology as well. And lastly, he rounds out this essay, again, criticizing scientists, and specifically criticizing the idea of seeking truth, trying to seek this objective truth, the good, the true. Still question where this value judgment comes from, and that leads him and it leads us to the next video, Beyond Good and Evil. So with all that said, this book was a bit of a doozy. There's a lot going on in here, a lot of big key concepts in the Nietzschean world of philosophy. So let me know what you guys think down below. What do you think of Resentiment? Where do you see this in society today? Because I certainly see shades of it, I think, in different groups and different areas within the world today. Same with, what do you think of the slave and mass morality? Is it accurate? Is it helpful to think about these concepts? Guilt, bad conscience, all that. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. I'm really enjoying this. I'm happy to see so far you guys engage and get to hear your perspectives on this. Again, I'm just kind of using this as an opportunity, as an excuse for me to dig deeper than I probably naturally would on something like this, because it does require a lot of focus, a lot of attention, a lot of notes. So it's been a ride, and I'll tell you, honestly, I'm getting a little Nietzsche'd out, so to speak. But we got 2 more books left to go. 2 more books to really dial in, focus, and see where we end up. And then we can kind of take a break, get to some literature, maybe go to read something a little bit easier, and then go from there. But anyway, that's it for this video. Like the video if you enjoyed it, subscribe it, share it with a friend if they're reading Nietzsche as well. Subscribe for more content coming up. Next week, we're reading Beyond Good and Evil, so try and catch up, try and read that bits of it, and I'll see you guys in the next one.